Thank you for having invited me to give a lecture on organizational communication. It would have been lovely to deliver this in person, but given our current situation, I'm happy enough to have this video lecture for you. Alright, so what exactly is organizational communication? Stanley Dietz, in an article, Conceptual Foundations, encouraged us to ask a different question, which is, what do we see or what are we able to do if we are to think of organizational communication in one way versus another, which means there are different ways. It means there are choices. All right, so it is the theories on the relationship between an organization and communication that have created the different lenses that either surface or hide organizational reality. As you can see from this picture, one is above the surface and one is beneath it. Right, so we have the different schools of organizational communication, or the schools of thought. What does it mean? A school is not only the institution that you go to in order to learn. It means a group. That's why we have the term school of fish. So we have a school of thought basically means shared ideas amongst a group of people. So these are various ways of theorizing or thinking of organizational communication. Right. So from this slide, you can see we have one organization, but there are different lenses. And as you can see from the different lenses, there are different images of what the organization looks like. These lenses are created by the different schools. We have the functional school, we have the interpretive and critical school, and we have the Montreal school. Okay, so how do each view organization and communication? So with the functional school, when you hear the word functional, what comes to your mind? Of course, it's the word function, right? And in order for you to function properly, you need tools. So communication is seen as such. It is tool-like. It's used to design, to control, and to monitor an organization, which is seen as a container. So communication happens within this container, within the organization, right? And as you can see from here, we have arrows that are moving in one direction. It is unilinear. Therefore, communication is passive. It comes from the top and just flows as such, right? So what management theory falls under this? We have the classical management theory. Given that leadership and decision making, basically when a decision is made, it is simply cascaded onto the workers. It is centralized. It comes from the top. It's cascaded to or relayed to the members of the organization. And even if they have specialized tasks, the tasks are streamlined in order to make sure that they're productive to serve the bottom line, which is profit. Again, top to bottom. Okay, right. So we have a table here which we will fill up as we go along. I just want you to remember that an organization for the functional school is like a container, and communication is occurring within that container. It is passive and it is tool-like. Right, let's move on to the interpretive and critical school. Okay, for the interpretive critical school, communication is continually being produced and reproduced amongst the members of the organization. Therefore, an organization is fluid. It's constantly ebbing and flowing. Now, let's discuss these two schools separately. Admittedly, when I encountered the words interpretive and critical, they seemed like big words to me. So my technique is I get the root word. So with the word interpretive, I have the word interpret. What is it that you do when you interpret something else? You give meaning. For example, if someone you really like gives you flowers, so you give meaning in order to define that action. You would interpret it as the person also likes you. Okay, in the same manner in an organization, the interpretive school, the purpose of which is for us to be able to understand the actions happening within the organization, okay, or the so-called organizational actions. Okay, a management theory that would apply to this is the theory of concerted control, because if I were a manager and I'd like to understand how or the meanings behind the organizational actions, I would like to understand what's going on in their mind, in their heart. I'd like to give them a voice to speak out, And accordingly, I would understand their limitations. Okay, let's move on. Now, for the critical school, we have the word critique. What is it that you do in order to critique properly? You analyze, and when you analyze, you break down an entire bit into its elements or its parts, and accordingly, you would now discover the relationships between the parts or the elements. And in an organization, we have the so called power relations. But since we're talking about meanings for the interpretive and critical school, we talk about the dominant versus the marginalized meanings. All right. What management theory is applicable for this or falls under this? We have the feminist theory. So previously, it were only the male attributes that were considered to be to be strong, and those associated with women, such as intuition and emotions, they were considered to be weakness or a form of weakness. But the feminist theory attempted to debunk this. Right. Let's move on to again to our table. I'd like you to remember that for the interpretive critical school, communication produces organization, and the organization as such is fluid. Let's move on to the Montreal School. Okay, for the Montreal School, an organization is seen to be equivalent to communication. What does it mean? Equivalent means equal in value. Okay, so communication is creative and it constitutes or binubuo ang isang organisasyon. It constitutes the organization which is then emergent from being constituted through communication or by communication. So from this slide, you can see here, just pay attention to the fact that with the Montreal School, it focuses on co-orienting on an object or co-tailoring, co-creating, and that there are negotiations happening amongst the organizational actors in order to achieve that. Right. Okay, so the theory that applies to this is the ventriloquist theory. I'd just like to read through. So, in the book Authority and Power in Social Interaction, the authors here and theorists studied authority and power as an interactional accomplishment, and matters of, as we mentioned earlier, negotiation for the participants in talk-in interaction. So, the negotiations among the organizational actors. And going back to the picture here, you think that it's a one-way stream, but no, it's not. Remember co-orientation, the actors ventriloquize, but they're also being ventriloquized by the routines. Right. Okay, let's okay, we have the table here. I want you to remember that communication here constitutes an organization, and as such, the organization is emergent from being constituted by communication. Okay, so we have three organizational communication concepts, which I'd like to discuss. We have process, structure and network, and culture. Okay, so for process, from the point of view of the functional school, it is seen as information transmission, as we mentioned earlier, point A to point B. Through this, we are able to design the input, whatever you want to put, the throughput, how it is sent, and the output, which is expected adherence. Interpretive and critical school, from the point of view of this school, it is a process again of making sense or giving meaning. When you make sense, it's that aha moment actually. And we are able to understand the members for the interpretive school, construction of meaning, and for the critical school, we have the contestation of meaning. And both or either of the two shape the organizational identity. Alright, for the Montreal School, it is more on the co-orienting on an object. We've discussed this a bit earlier. We are able to understand that yes, there are organizational conflicts, given that there are differences in worldview. But again, there are negotiations amongst the organizational actors to settle this. Right, let's move on now to structure and network. Okay, so for the functional school, it is like a matter of static connection of nodes. Remember the flask again earlier, there were stoppages. Okay, so from here we are able to identify who is the authority because it is a one-way stream. The basis would be the source of the information, which in this case is the boss. Right, So, with interpretive and critical school, again, it's all about meaning and the structure of meanings. So, meanings that either define or dominate the organization. Remember the discussion on power relations. Okay, and last for structure and network, we have the Montreal School. From the point of view of the school, we have the configuration of agents. So we have the actors, right? How are they configured in an organization? But you have to remember, we don't only have the human elements, we also have the non-human elements. So how are they configured within the organization or within an organizational object? Okay, so we have the culture, which is very important in every organization, such as the environment and atmosphere, the compensation standards and policies, the people, the leadership, and in total, the organization. Okay, so from the point of view of the functional school, it focuses on what the organization has. We are able to identify what is innate in an organization. For example, in my previous company, we have a culture of kindness. But since, for example, for a performance evaluation, we had to borrow something from the environment, which was the kick, kiss, kick approach, which means that we have to tell the person what is wrong with the person, kiss the person again by saying, no, you can do it, and then kick the person again by saying, but you have to change what needs to be changed in order for you to remain in the organization. Okay, for the interpretive and critical school, it focuses on what the organization is on a day-to-day basis, from Monday to Saturday, Sunday to Saturday, for that matter. So you're able to create an organizational script because you observe, dutifully. And because of that, we have this Filipino expression, basang-basa na kita. I'm able to, based on the historical, details, I will be able to anticipate the actions. Okay, you have your projections. All right. For the Montreal School, we have cultures in actions. Remember the actors with different worldviews? Okay, based on that, we can explain the differences in action. Right. Let's just brisk through the approaches taken by the different schools when studying organizational communication. So, for the functional school, we have the deductive approach, wherein the theory dictates or defines what data needs to be collected. As such, we have the so-called objective reality. Okay? This helps us determine, for example, a cause of a dysfunctional organization. Right? This is the approach of the functional school. For the interpretive critical school, on the other hand, we have the inductive approach. How is it different from the deductive approach? With the inductive approach, you have your data without any theory. And based on that data, you now generate the theory. That is called a subjective reality because I, as the researcher, I have my interpretation of what the data means. There's this movie and a line that says, it's all about the interpretation, which is correct, because a different researcher may have a different interpretation of my data. So it's all about meanings behind the action. Now, last but not the least, we have the abductive approach wherein the theory and the data collected are mutually defining. So the subjective and the objective reality here is shown, and we are able to give a theoretical explanation which is both grounded or sensible and plausible. These are proceeding from facts to an explanatory hypothesis. I was only given 10 minutes to explain everything, but I hope I was able to give clarity on the different schools of organizational communication, the concepts, and how we study or the approaches taken by these. So thank you very, very much. Have a nice day, everyone.